Today we're looking at House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. This is a book that's been sat on my bookshelf for about 2 years, and because I know it's quite an intense book, it's quite difficult, it's just been sat there and I haven't been wanting to read it, but I finally decided to pick it up. And I'm glad that I did because although it was a challenging read, it was a fantastic one, and I'm looking forward to digging into the book today. Part 1, Summary. The House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski is a complicated work of postmodernist metafiction. At its core, the book is about a young man named Johnny Truant, who discovers an academic manuscript written by a deceased old man named Zampano. This manuscript tells the story of a documentary film called The Navison Record, which chronicles a family's experience with a strange and ever-expanding house that defies the laws of physics. As Johnny reads Zampano's manuscript, he becomes obsessed with deciphering its meaning and uncovering the truth behind the mysterious house. The narrative is presented through a series of footnotes, appendices, and annotations, creating a multi-layered reading experience that blurs the lines between reality and fiction. As the manuscript progresses, Johnny's narrative intrudes further and further onto the main story, and Zampano's own manuscript becomes increasingly strange and broken. The manuscript also contains notes from the editor of both Johnny's notes and the manuscript. The Navison Record follows the journey of Will Navison, a photojournalist, and his family as they move into a house on Ash Tree Lane. Soon, they discover that the house is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, leading to a labyrinthine maze of ever-shifting corridors and rooms. As the house begins to exert a malevolent influence on the family, tensions rise and their sanity is tested. Part 2. A found footage novel. Reading House of Leaves, I couldn't help but make analogies to the found footage trend in horror films. Things like the Blair Witch Project, where the film is presented as if it were a real film, and it's some footage that's been found of some terrifying event. And House of Leaves does a similar thing. We have this manuscript that was written by Zampano, found by Johnny Truant, and at some point sent by Johnny to an editor who is now publishing the manuscript. And so we have notes from the editor, from Johnny, and also the manuscript itself. And so the book presents itself as if it really was this discovered piece of work, and it's embedded in reality. Unlike those found footage films, though, which are typically just, 55 minutes of boring nothing happening, all leading up to one somewhat scary jump scare, this book is actually quite frightening and quite consistently so. Whether it's reading Johnny's notes on the manuscript and seeing him lose his mind as we progress through the story, whether it's the Navison Record, the film itself, which is also pretty terrifying, or Zampano's own mental anguish as he's making this book and also seemingly losing his mind, if he had it much to begin with already. Or even reading the appendices of the novel. For example, Johnny has letters from his mother. There's a whole collection of these letters that she sent to him while she was in a mental institution, and they are pretty disturbing as well. There's so much going on in the story that is just outright terrifying, unlike those found footage films. A lot of the novel is also designed to make it feel hyper-realistic. I'll talk a bit more about this later, but it's essentially a parody of academic writing. Zampano is writing his manuscript in an academic style. It has footnotes, all the kinds of things you would expect in an academic work, including the convoluted writing. It's also got references to real-life critics, literary critics, film critics, academics, all of this just adding to that sense of realism and really throwing you into this world. Another reason why this works so well is that Danielewski really understands his source material. A lot of those found footage films just have bad actors because they're low budget, whereas Danielewski writes really well. He mirrors the academic style really well. Johnny has a narrative voice that's very different from Zampano's academic writing. It all just comes together so perfectly, and it's hyper-realistic, despite the fact that the actual concept of this house that's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, obviously that is supernatural and strange, but there's also a sense, and I'll talk about this a bit more too, that maybe none of this is real. Maybe it is just the ramblings of an insane person. All those questions, all that uncertainty, and Danielewski's really excellent writing style all come together to make an excellent version of this found footage phenomena. Part 3. A Parody of Academia. So as someone who is an academic, I read a lot of academic work, and I really found the parody of academic style excellent in this book and very funny in places. There are so many ridiculously convoluted lines where these academics are pontificating about the meaning of not of Zampano's work, of the film, and it just reads like things that you would read if you picked up a literary journal, for example. Just a lot of babble, a lot of meaningless nonsense, a lot of over-analysis. All the stuff that academics are sort of criticised for is here in this book. And some of it is just so on point that if you came across it in an actual journal, you might not be able to pick up that it's a joke. The book even has parodies of actual academics. Two of my favourites crop up in here, Harold Bloom and Camille Paglia. With Bloom, we get the typical sort of overly verbose, ridiculous style that Bloom is known for, and with Paglia we get that sassy streetwise grit that she does. She gives her typical analysis of art when she's talking about the Navidson record, and she also flirts with Karen Navidson, the husband of Will Navidson from the film, and she tries to get her to go on a date with her, which I found hilarious and somewhat believable. I could sort of imagine Paglia doing that in the context of that interview. If you're aware of academia and the tropes and the style, I think you'll appreciate this. And there are lots of other critics that are mentioned too. And so if you recognise any familiar faces, it would be good to sort of pay attention to that and think about how well Danielewski parodies these voices, because I think he does an excellent job pretty much across the board. And that's really no easy feat, because when you're having so many different footnotes and academic voices in the story, actually getting pinning down those different styles is quite a difficult thing to do, but I think Danielewski does it really well. The structure of the novel also serves to sort of mirror the sense of confusion and just what is going on that sometimes you feel when you're reading academic work. The book is broken up into fragments in places. There are so many footnotes that you get lost in them, and that really is sometimes what it's like reading an academic work. Sometimes academics do just seem to be talking absolute nonsense. They get lost in their own footnotes. They're talking about responses to responses, and it just gets all too much. And I think that Danielewski does an excellent job of just capturing that sense of complete befuddlement sometimes when you're engaging with academic work. It's also quite impressive that he manages to do this without coming across as boring. Another big trope of academic work is typically it's quite dry. You know, when you're producing a piece of academic work, you're not necessarily trying to be entertaining, you're trying to articulate the truth, and sometimes that does require, complications, nuance, and that's sometimes why academic work can become the way it becomes. Sometimes it can be trying to obscure some things as well, but I think oftentimes it genuinely is just, this is complicated, and so it needs a sort of sophistication in language. But obviously that makes it very boring to read. Danielewski manages to capture that, but without making it boring. There are some bits, sometimes the footnotes get a bit much, but on the whole I think he does a pretty good job of not making his work so like academia that it becomes dreary to read. And I think part of that is just to do with the supernatural nature of the plot, the mystery of the Navidson record, the Johnny's notes, which obviously aren't very academic. All of that stuff stops it from just becoming overly dry and laborious to read. Part 4. Terror versus horror. So I've talked about the distinction between terror and horror writing before on the channel, mainly in reference to Gothic literature. Horror writing occurs when you are explicit in the kind of fear that you're trying to evoke, so there'll be blood and guts and gore, and typically the modern horror genre is just horror writing, mostly. Everything's about the gore, the guts, the blood, the violence, whereas terror writing tends to be more internal, a sense of dread, a sense of fear. Sometimes in terror writing, actually the seemingly supernatural things that are occurring might just be phantoms of the person's mind. It's all about the unseen and that suspense. The modern equivalent of that would be something like a psychological horror film. But typically even there is more of a focus on the horror side of things. But with House of Leaves, we pretty much get a book that focuses almost exclusively on terror. There are bits of gore and violence, but the novel calls into question the reality of these things all the time. And it really does focus a lot more on this internal sense of dread and fear. Just the fact that there's this house, which is slightly uncanny in the fact that it's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. That there's this labyrinth which is dark and people get lost in it and they just get caught up in their own thoughts and delusions. All of that stuff conforms to this terror style of horror, which I do think is less well done these days, mainly because people tend to prefer the other style. So it's impressive that we get an example of the terror writing here, and we get it done so effectively as well. Anyone that prefers the sort of more psychological kind of horror, I think would definitely enjoy this book. But be prepared, because it is genuinely quite scary, which is not something I say often when it comes to books. It's quite hard to get a scare out of a book, but just because of the unsettling nature of it, because of the element of realism where this is presented as if it is something that was discovered, and because it's sort of not clear whether it really happened or whether it's insane ramblings, all of that just adds to that feeling of unease when you read it. It's not scary in the way that you might get scared when you watch a horror film and you're, jumping and screaming and things like that, but it's unsettling and creepy, and that's a very impressive thing to sustain, especially in a book that's quite hard to read, because the problem, of course, with that is, if it's too hard to read, it can become boring. So that it manages to be unsettling and also be the kind of book that it is really impressive. Part 5. What is reality anyway? So works of metafiction typically call into question the lines between reality and fiction, all of that stuff, and House of Leaves is no exception to this. We have the Navinton record as a film, which was made by Will. We then have Zampano's manuscript about this film. We then have the various academics and critics commenting on this film and the events. We then have Johnny's notes on the manuscript. We then have the editor's notes on Johnny's notes and the manuscript. And then we have the appendices containing things like the letters from Johnny's mother. All of these adding to the story and leading us to question whether or not this story is true, whether it's false, whether it's something in between. There's so much to unpack and think about that it's definitely a book that you'd have to read more than once. I've only read it once, but I can definitely see myself reading it more than once and possibly my opinions changing every time I read it and I pick up on new things that I didn't see before. For example, we know that Johnny's mother was mentally unstable. She spent her life in an insane asylum for the most part. And so we have to wonder, is Johnny just going mad as he's found this manuscript? We can also tell from Zampano's manuscript that he also seemed pretty unstable as well. And one thing that we find in the story is that Zampano is often referencing, these critics and thinkers as if he spoke to them sometimes or as if they've written books. But there are the occasional notes from the editor and even Johnny which call into question whether or not these books or these critics actually engaged with the work at all. There are a couple of places where I think Johnny has tried to actually contact people about the film and they don't want to talk about it. And this could be read in one of two ways. Either they don't want to talk about it because it did happen and they're freaked out by it and they just want to ignore it, or they are very much aware of Zampano as some nutter that used to ring them up about this mental fantasy that he had, and they don't want anything more to do with it. And the book is pretty much open to either analysis. And like I said before, that's why it's such a creepy book that leans into that terror style of horror, because it just isn't clear what is real and what is fiction. To some extent, I do lean on the side of perhaps this is all just some kind of insane thing. Zampano, for whatever reason, was mad. He wrote this book. Johnny's madness somehow gets triggered by it, and all of the stuff about his mother and her mental issues are sort of meant to signal that to the reader, that we're not meant to trust Johnny or Zampano. But again, maybe not. Maybe they're insane because of something supernatural. We never really know what's going on. On top of all this, there is just the confusion around the manuscript itself. Even if it's true, there are parts of it that are missing. I think Johnny accidentally burnt some of it at one point. There's a whole bit that is crossed out. It's in the manuscript, but with like red pen through it, where Zampano, he uses a Minotaur analogy to describe the labyrinth in the house and the potential creature inside of it. And at some point he decided he didn't like that metaphor for some reason, and so it's all crossed out. There are things like that. There's bits where it refers you to an appendices that you should read in order to get a perspective on something, and then that doesn't exist. So there's all of this further mystery as well. Does it not exist? Did it ever exist? We'll never know. Part 6. Piecing the puzzle. In some ways, House of Leaves is more of a puzzle book than it is a novel. It's certainly not a novel in the traditional sense of the term, with a kind of linear story. As I said, it's sort of framed as this found manuscript with notes, but even just trying to read it and understand it, in many places it does feel like reading puzzles. And there are some like quite clear puzzles in the book. For example, in one of the letters from Johnny's mother, she basically writes him a coded message where the first letter of each word is a letter in the actual message that she's sending. It's a very creepy message that she's sending as well. But you have to basically do that in order to understand the letter. But even just more generally, there are some bits of the book where there's just one word on a page, and sometimes the words are sort of mirroring. Say the characters are descending into the labyrinth, the words will mirror the descent. If there's a drop, the words drop. And all of that stuff just adds to this very interactive, tactile way that you engage with the book. Sometimes you have to turn it upside down to read it on its side. all of this stuff adding to this sense of just being completely disorientated, and adding to this sense that you are in the labyrinth yourself, just because the book kind of forces you to engage with it on a physical level. And I think that's really impressive, because typically we think of reading as a very cerebral activity. It's not something that we do really out loud anymore with friends. It's something that you do in your head, staring at the page. But by forcing the reader to pick the book up, to turn it around, to go back and forward constantly, you really feel like you're, a researcher trying to investigate this manuscript yourself, but you're also physically engaging with the book in a way that you don't normally engage with books. And I think that does change the reading experience somewhat, because it just becomes a little bit more physical, a little bit more externalized than the typical sort of internal, thoughtful way that people read. And I think that's a really impressive thing to pull off. As I said, my current interpretation of the book is perhaps that it is mostly insane ramblings, but I'm looking forward to reading it again and just really coming to grips with how I feel about it, because again, it's just so ambiguous and so unclear, and there's so much going on that it's really hard to have a determinate interpretation of the book, which is great for rereadability. Part 7, Conclusion. House of Leaves is an absolutely excellent novel. It's a terrifying story, and it manages to be terrifying despite the fact that it's parodying a very dry academic style a lot of the time. It's also, I would recommend it if you haven't read any of this sort of postmodern metafiction style. I would recommend reading this, not because it's an easy read by any means, because it isn't. It's quite challenging, and to be fair, in some places it does get a bit grating. But I think because the plot is, a horror, essentially, it has this sort of thing that pulls you back in a way where maybe something like, Virginia Woolf's modernist novels or James Joyce, the stuff there is less immediate, because it's less sort of, hitting you in the gut in the way that horror does. And so I think by having this sort of mystery plot, this horror plot, it just adds a sense of fight and urgency to the story that, if you're not familiar with this style of writing, that might carry you through it, even if you're struggling a little bit with the actual prose style. So I would definitely recommend it. As a horror novel, I would recommend it. As a example of impressive metafiction or postmodernist fiction, if you prefer, I would recommend it there as well. And I do think it's pretty good for a beginner as well. Overall, I thought it was an excellent book, and I'm glad that after 2 years of owning the thing, I finally got round to reading it. That is it for my review. Let me know down in the comments if you've read House of Leaves. What did you think of it? Did you find it scary? Did you find it boring? Did you recognise the sort of parody of academia and particular critics? Did you find that funny or not? Let me know what you think down in the comments. Otherwise, take care everyone. Ta-ra.